7 companies pre-qualified for the Kaduna Distribution companies and are to proceed to the next stage of the privatization bidding process, while 3 companies similarly qualified for the Afam distribution company in Rivers State, Nigeria's South region. They are Primesia Energy Limited, Test Power Limited and Tavares Group. Well, these companies have been cleared to proceed to the final bidding stage. With most of the companies yet to complete an outstanding 75% payment of the bid, a new handover date to the private sector has been fixed for October 2013. Well, to review the Nigerian power sector, I'm joined in the studio by Akiyemi Oshunubi. He's a director at Riverbank Capital. Thank you so much for joining us, Akiyemi.
Thanks, Oyin.
Now, 7 companies, pre-qualified for the Kaduna Discos. Now, they're to proceed to the next stage from the reports we're getting. What's the deadline really? The deadline, I just mentioned now was for October. What was the initial deadline, and how fast do you think this, the whole process is moving?
Well, just to recap, the new investors signed a purchase and sale agreement back in February, and they made their 25% down payment in March. According to the investment, to the BPE timelines, they should have put up their 75% balance in 90 days, which is actually in June. And in June, and then you'll have had a handover in July. The news that came out in June was not one of that payment had been effected, but that the handover date had been moved to October 2013. So we can assume that perhaps a few of the bidders have not been able to come up with the 75%. Now, it may not be indicative of lack of financial support. It may be some things in their investment documentation, some things on the government side that's not been completed. So that has moved to about to October 2013. The Ministry of Finance, or the Power Minister, was a bit defensive by announcing, when people questioned whether the new NIPP transaction would slip by the same timelines. And he said, oh, that next June 2014, that for sure they were going to hand over those new transactions. So, but I guess you could say that they will learn quite a bit from the process that's ongoing with all the slippages, and they should try and correct for the transactions that are following on. All
right then. Now let's touch on the deadline for the payment of the outstanding 75% for the ownership of the Discos and Gencos. Now, how's that coming? What sources are they seeking funds at the moment? Because 75%, that's a huge one.
Yeah, it's mostly from banks, banks and private equity institutions. The way the BP structured it was that you had to put in a minimum of 30% and 70% debt. So that 25% has probably drawn down. Most of the bidders have probably already drawn down on their equity investments, and the balance is supposed to come from banking financial institutions. So the bulk of that is going to come from banks, and we know a number of Nigerian banks are participating in that process. But what's also happening is that they're drawing from a lot of their foreign facilities. So a Stanbic Bank would have Standard Bank of South Africa at its back, and First Bank would have some other partners. They probably can afford some of them on their own balance sheets. But it's primarily going to come from the banks. And as you know, the banks will want to dot their I's and cross their T's. So if there's anything on the government's part that hasn't been fulfilled, it will be difficult for the banks to come to financial closing. Just about a month ago, we heard that the liabilities for the former PHCN staff had not been completely paid up, and the National Assembly was taking the Ministry of Finance to task. So those sorts of issues could be part of the reasons why the banks have not closed on their own part.
But do you foresee them? Do you really foresee a handover date in October 2013?
Well, I'm not sure that's the honest truth. I guess they reset a time that the banks, my understanding is that they actually set that date based on comments from transaction advisors, from the lawyers and the banks as to how long it would take for them to get comfortable to effect those payments. So I'm fairly hopeful that October will be that time, but they've been slipping on some of those dates.
Well, tell us more about the 59.5 billion naira proceed of the sale of Egbin Power Plant allocated to Nigerian Bulk Electricity Trading Company. Now, how is this supposed to hasten the process in any way?
Well, the combination of the bidder for that asset was KEPCO, the Korean electric power company, with its Nigerian partners, Sahara, about $400 and something million. But I think it's a good development that the government does recognize that the bulk trader needs to have cash backing the guarantees and the contracts. The purchase power agreement is going to be signing with some of these asset owners that are going to close. And so what they announced was out of the 59.95 billion naira proceeds, about 9.95 will be retained by the BPE to run its operations and to do other things. There are two other privatization events that are going to happen in the next 2 years. And then about 50 billion will be assigned to the bulk trader to bulk up its balance sheet. From last time we heard, I think they were just giving about $1 billion naira to start up the operation. So, so this is not money to be spent on operations, but to have to back the contracts. And that is, I think, a healthy development, especially given that the partial risk guarantee that was announced by the World Bank, the last I heard, they were asking the Africa Development Bank to kick in about $250 million. So, you know, so this augments that significantly and will bring some confidence to the process.
All right then. Now the Nigerian president, you know, called for a move towards greater industrialization. I mean, looking at the reform in the power sector, we have lots of, you know, private players from the, from the private sector coming in, rather players from the private sector coming in. But let's face reality here. Now, do we really have a skilled manpower to drive this vision, especially in the power sector? You have foreign companies coming in. I'm sure, talking about promoting the local content policy, there are already fears, you know, of the companies from Asia coming in, you know, to even take over what's left. But let's look at it. Do we even have the skilled manpower locally to drive this vision the president just talked about?
For certain, becoming an industrial power does depend on the power sector. We've heard, and the stories are true, that PHCN has not developed new engineers in the last couple of decades. But all of the bidders and all of the new owners actually had to put up a training plan. So there's a plan for moving technical skills from their foreign technical partners to the local companies to train Nigerians. But there's also a part to play within the PHCN used to have a national training institute that all the operators in the industry, in the transition industry, will contribute funds towards and help train staff. But there's a bit of work to do. The first phase of just acquiring the assets or privatizing that asset, hopefully, knock on wood, that goes through towards the end of the year. But almost immediately after, you have to start worrying about ensuring that any new assets developed or refurbished can be maintained, and that has to be done with local staff. And training is going to be a key thing to that. So that's still yet to be done, but it's in the brain right now, I should say.